What's up everybody? Rob here from Miles Board, and if you've got a Miles Rampage, this video is for you. It's been about 1 year since we initially launched the Rampage, and we've learned a lot since then, especially from our amazing users riding and coming up with feedback and suggestions on how to improve the product. Special thanks to Sawyer Reynolds from LA Skate in particular for suggesting many of the improvements and also helping other riders get those in on their boards. So without further ado, come with me and let's check out the board. All right, so the first thing we're gonna look at on the board is just some important hardware. Make sure everything is tight because as we're riding, there's a lot of vibrations and that can work the nuts and bolts loose. So you wanna frequently check on any skateboard, especially electric skateboard, that all the hardware is in there tight. And a few things we'll check first. Very important here is the hardware that holds the motor mounts onto the trucks, it holds the motors onto the motor mounts, and also the wheels onto the axle. The bolts that hold the motor mounts onto the truck here are especially important. We want to make sure that these are tight. If they do work themselves loose and you've got play here, that play can cause a lot of excessive force on the bolt and eventually, in the worst case, cause these bolts to snap. That's something obviously you don't want to happen while you're riding. So we need to make sure these are very tight. To check the tension by hand, what I'm going to do is just press in, and this is an easy way of doing it. Just press in on the other side of this and tighten it with a crescent screw, and you'll know if it's loose. You should feel a lot of movement. This, I'm not feeling very much movement at all. I can tell they're quite tight. If you do need to tighten these down though, however, you will need to remove the wheel and the pulley here to have access to the other side to be able to really tighten it. And for those instructions, you can refer to our belt tensioning video, where you'll be able to see how to take off the wheel, the belt and pulley and go from there. For the more hardcore riders out there, we've seen some people actually replacing these bolts, which are M4 size, with an M5 bolt. So a little bit thicker and stronger, especially if you're doing hardcore riding. That may be a sweet improvement for some guys out there. So essentially what they're doing is just removing this motor mount, drilling out each of these holes just slightly wider and replacing this hardware that is M4 now with M5 hardware. I will put the exact M5 hardware that people are using in the description below. However, one thing to note, if you do this and drill these holes out, you're gonna have less material on each side of the truck here. So you may potentially weaken this part of the truck to get the stronger screw there. Personally, I rock the stock screws on this. I ride very hard, never had an issue at all. But if you want something even stronger in there, feel free to make that change yourself. While we're back here looking at the motor and these screws, another thing to check out is the belts themselves and the belt tension especially. Because these are belt driven, this is an expendable part. The belts of the board over time, they do need to be replaced and also tightened because the belt can stretch. So we do have a video on how to replace and tighten the belts. The link is below in the video. The belt, by the way, it's a 5M430 belt and you can get the 15mm wide version. We'll leave that spec below as well if you do need to get replacement belts, or you can order them from our shop. Next nuts and bolts we're gonna check are on the actual wheels. Call me paranoid, but I just like to check these myself, make sure my wheels aren't gonna fall off. It's never happened to me. They do have a strong nylon locking nut, but I do like to check those every once in a while. Better safe than sorry. Make sure the nuts that are holding your wheel on are the proper tension. If you start to see them coming off, obviously not a good sign. You can also move this wheel back and forth. If you notice much play in the wheel when you try and move it back and forth, that could mean your nut is too loose and needs to be tightened. These are all good though. The next hardware to take a look at, this is rare, but more common than the axle nuts, is for the nuts holding the trucks on to come loose. So there's only 4 nuts and bolts here holding the trucks onto the deck themselves. If you do get 1 or 2 loose, they can start to move and cause damage to the deck. Even more so if all of them come loose, they can come off. Now I actually feel one loose right here. If you look at this nut, this has actually worked itself loose a little bit. So I'm gonna have to tighten that one. All the rest of these are tight though, and you can confirm with a tool. So to tighten this bolt, I've got an 8mm hex key on the nut itself and a 3mm Allen key on the screw on the other side. There we go. So you want this to be tight, but not so tight that it's gonna damage the board or strip out the screw on the other side. You'll feel it when it feels really solid. You're just about there. Now, that thing's not going anywhere. So while you're here, you might as well check the other ones too. This one's a tiny bit loose. If you look at that, and one of the reasons they can come loose is there's so much pressure on this wood deck that it can just squeeze it. And sometimes it's not the nut coming loose, but it's just making more room because it's squeezing that deck. So I'll tighten this one too. So that's not all the hardware on the board. There's a few more items. Of course, you do have your double kingpin trucks on the Rampage, and those I will let you adjust to your heart's content, whatever is more comfortable for you. There are also the 8 bolts that hold the battery housing onto the deck. You wanna make sure those are tight, but before we do that, I wanna show you something inside the board that's very important depending on when you ordered your board. There's something we wanna check out in there. Make sure everything looks good and that there's nothing that can cause your board to stop working prematurely. Recently, we've received a few batteries back at the shop that have had a connector broken, and upon investigation, we found out this was linked to a very tight clearance between the battery connection and the battery housing itself. So I wanna show you inside what that looks for. It has been eliminated in future versions of the board or recent shipments, but if you received one of the most early Rampages, this may apply to you. I wanna make sure that's covered so you don't have your battery connector get broken. So we're going to take off this battery housing just by unscrewing the bolts. And I recommend, by the way, get a nice set of Allen keys if you do have any skateboard at all. This is the 4mm Allen key I'm using here. And we're just gonna take all these bolts out. All right, now that the bolts are removed from the battery housing, you see this can just move around here. So what I'm gonna do is hold it to the side and just make sure I have everything in my hand, and I can set this battery box down. So the original Rampages, the first versions, this part of the battery box came really close to the switch here. And this part also came very close to this plug. So with little clearance between the battery box and the plug, what can happen is if this battery shifts, it can knock either side of these plugs out. And so to fix this, what we've done on this board, we've already done it, is just to cut out this part of the battery box to allow that clearance room so that that does not happen in the future. In addition, you'll see we've also inserted some foam in between the side of the battery and the battery housing. So there's some foam in here, 4 pieces, and that's gonna ensure that this battery can't move side to side. If your battery has any movement side to side like that, you can put that foam on there. I do really recommend you checking out your battery. If you do have a clearance issue between that battery housing and the plugs there, you definitely wanna cut out part of that battery housing. You can use some wire snips or even a razor blade to get in there. And of course, don't go touching the battery with these metal things, but you can just carefully cut out 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch of that wall of the battery housing to leave enough room for those plugs. We've seen several of these come in recently with a damaged plug and had to fix that. So we don't want that to happen to you when you're riding. Obviously, not great if it stops working. It can even be dangerous if you suddenly lose power in the middle of a ride. So please check that out. We have made improvements to how this works on Rampages. So depending on which version you had, you may have this clearance issue, you may not. Definitely worth checking out. While we're down here as well, we want to check on the other screws here. We want to make sure that the screws holding the controller are tight, that there's no movement on that the charging plug is not loose. To tighten that, if it is loose, there's just a nut back here, and that every connection in here is very tight, that nothing has come loose, and it's all looking good to me. Once you've done that, you can reinstall the battery box exactly how we took it off. So I'm just gonna stick it on the deck here, hold it tight by hand and flip it back over, and then proceed to install the screws exactly how I took them off. All right, now that your final bolt is in, your Rampage is ready to go. You're ready to shred again. Please be safe out there. If you got any questions about these, or you've got feedback, ways to improve the product, feel free to reach out to us, help@milespower.com. If this video has been helpful to you at all, please take 1 second, hit that subscribe button, like, comment, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe, guys. No, I'm not.